Hey everybody, I'm Stephanie. I will be presenting today along with Rishi, who is presenting remotely. Pranay is out of town, so he is not here, so we're gonna get chaotic evil without him, I guess. This week's session is about international governance and empire. So we're really wanting to dig into the different systems and strategies and different setups of international governance and how that plays into imperialism and the entire system overall. So that's talking about like the UN, United Nations, international law, and the systems that exist right now and how we are functioning within those. And we'll go through a couple of case studies as well. First, we're going to dig into a couple of quotes from a few speakers. One is Nelson Mandela, where globalization means, as it so often does, that the rich and powerful now have new means to further enrich and empower themselves at the cost of the poorer and weaker. We have a responsibility to protest in the name of universal freedom. And that is a quote from Nelson Mandela. And then we have Sharon Burrow, who is a labor organizer and activist in Australia, who said globalization could be the answer to many of the world's seemingly intractable problems, but this requires strong democratic foundations based on a political will to ensure equity and justice. We're going to go ahead and dig right into the United Nations, how that system is set up, and the history and the intended role, and what it actually looks like in practice. Essentially, the UN was created right after World War II ended. Basically, major world powers were really depleted. They had all been in war for, years, and international relations and diplomacy were in shambles. So the United Nations Charter was created by representatives of 50 different countries in order to prevent another world war, to keep the same thing from happening again that they had just lived through. At the time, this was pushed through by Franklin D. Roosevelt, specifically with the control in mind of the US, the Soviet Union, the UK, and China. They were the predominant warmongers of the time, so to speak. From the beginning, the goal was to keep those four powers all at the same level and balanced without prioritizing any other countries. It was really focused on making sure that all four of them felt like they were at the same level of buy-in. It was created without intended equity among the different signatories. This is the list of signatories the very first year after the UN Charter was taken place, 1945. The light blue are founding members, and the dark blue are the protectorates and territories of those founding members. So they were informally part of the UN underneath whoever their colonizer was, but they were not actually their own signatory to the United Nations until much later on. Many of those members were not officially sovereign. They were still colonized or dependent territories. We're talking about Belarus, Ukraine, India, and the Philippines, which just continue to perpetuate the existing legal system. So even though the system was already established unfairly to have those four be the legs of the stool, I guess we could say, everybody else that was a part of it was either second rung or even farther down the hierarchy. The overarching system was created to give outsized power to those four nations, and that has really resulted in basically a paralysis of the UN for really critical issues. Cold War vetoes by Russia, US vetoes for basically everything, et cetera. We're going to get into some of those examples in just a few minutes. But yeah, that's kind of where we're starting. The UN is the only platform that currently exists where most states are involved in discussions. And there's a reason for that asterisk in what I said then too. The way that the UN is set up, there are 6 different bodies of the UN. We are going to talk today about the main 3. Honestly, the ones that matter the most. We've got the General Assembly, that's 193 countries. This is the only UN organ where all countries have equal representation. Out of the 6 main bodies, UNGA is the only one where everybody gets the same vote and their vote is worth as much. And there's no veto process. So that's 193 member states, like recognized countries, plus the Holy See, the Vatican City, and Palestine, who has observer status, as does the EU. I will also tell you guys what observer status means in just a second too. So UNGA resolutions are not binding. It's really just a way of symbolizing the sense of the overall international community and their position on a certain issue, which is why you guys will see a resolution gets passed in UNGA about Palestine, for example. That doesn't actually mean that there is any binding commitment made by any of the signatories or any of the member states who are part of the United Nations. And that basically means that if they're not binding, they're not legally enforceable. Which is why even if something passes in UNGA for Palestine, it doesn't actually mean that that is going to change the way that the United States is intervening in that state. Second body that is also critically important is the UN Security Council. They are responsible for international security issues, maintenance of international peace and security. They have 15 members. 5 of those members, I'm sure you will all be shocked to know, are permanent. I will just say, I'm sure you guys can guess as I say them: US, UK, France, China, and Russia. All 5 of them are forever on the Security Council. And that means that they have veto power. The other 10 rotate in and out, and they do not have veto power over this body. They also, the United Nations Security Council, can put in place a binding resolution that forces all of the other member states of the United Nations to comply with whatever that resolution says. This is where a lot of stuff gets hung up. I'm sure you guys will be shocked to know. One of the things I wanted to flag for you guys was that the main 5, the 5 permanent members, can veto anything, including resolutions that involve the admission of new member states. For example, Palestine. Sorry, I keep hammering that home, but I'm real pissed about Palestine. The Security Council is the only part of the United Nations that has enforcement, aka accountability powers. So that takes place in the form of UN peacekeepers. We will talk about them a little bit more too. So the third piece we're going to get into a little bit later, and that is the International Court of Justice. So the UN, as I mentioned, only system of its kind with all 193 states that are present and discussing and focusing on diplomacy and international issues. It is the only place where everybody can come together to hash things out, and the goal is to prevent further war, bloodshed, genocide. There are other platforms, for example, like the European Union, but that consists entirely of European member states. There is ECOWAS, which is the I forget what the C stands for, Economic Council Group of West African States. There's one in Asia, and there's also the African Union. The majority of those tend to be focused on regional economic issues and concerns. So with the EU, it facilitates easy movement from country to country with the passport that's within the EU. In practice, as I'm sure you guys can already tell, the UN has some pretty major flaws. First, the establishment perpetuated existing systems of imperialism at the time, as we mentioned. So the bodies like the UN Special Committee on Non-Self-Governing Territories was one of the earlier parts of the UN components. It still exists, but it's no longer as powerful. At the time, so that was the UN Special Committee on Non-Self-Governing Territories. That is the umbrella where all of those countries that were in dark blue fell under at the time. Basically, that's the list of countries that were currently colonized, so their vote counted as their colonizers' opinion. And that special committee enabled colonizers to define the dependency of a country, to say these people don't have this type of legal system established and set up, so they're not independent enough to actually have a voice in the United Nations. So they created their own self-justification for continued imperialism and colonization post-World War II. In December 1946, 72 different territories were defined as territories whose people have not yet attained a full measure of self-government. They even established a special status called trust territories, very similar to the way that the United States handled indigenous rights in the US. This emphasized the imperialist take that these territories could not appropriately govern themselves and therefore needed another country, a colonizer, to oversee their engagement. That's, again, perpetuating that system of paternalism and white saviorism. Some of the examples: Belgium, on behalf of the Belgian Congo at the time, which is now DRC. Congo achieved independence, aka full statehood, in 1960, as did most of the rest of West Africa and from France. And at that point, they became full member states. Vietnam became free from France in 1948 and became its own member state. Indonesia from the Netherlands in 49, and Jamaica from the UK in 62. Those are just some of the examples that I was able to come across. So today, there are still 17 non-self-governing territories that are on the list. These are countries that basically don't have enough governance by the colonizer's opinion, or whoever holds veto power in the UN Security Council, to count as their own country. It's about 2 million people around the world, and it consists of Western Sahara, Bermuda, US Virgin Islands, Guam, etc. So sure you guys will be shocked by this. For 15 out of these 17 states, the administering power, the colonizing power, is either the UK, 59%, the US, 18%, or France, 12%. Weirdly, New Zealand is one of them for some reason. So the second piece that I wanted to dig into is the major power imbalance. There is an outsized power, obviously, given to a handful of colonizers. All of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are former colonizers. We don't have, there are seats that rotate for the rest of the 15, so the other 10 seats rotate after 2-year periods. But the power of underdeveloped countries is limited at best, even if they combine forces into a coalition. So for example, there is called the A3, and that's Africa 3, and it's usually 3 African countries that decide that they're going to band together and vote the same way once they have 3 seats on the Security Council. They agree that they will coordinate all of their votes. They don't carry the same weight because none of them have veto power. So yeah, I'm trying not to get too negative right out of the gate, guys. Sorry. Remember last week when Pranay was talking about the United States specifically funding increasing, going to different countries when they cycle onto the Security Council? That is because the United States is then dangling money over their heads to push them to align with US positioning. So whereas A3, they share similar historical backgrounds in terms of colonization, the United States has a huge amount of money and they hold that over the heads of other countries. For example, Democratic Republic of the Congo just joined the Security Council 2 weeks ago, so we will see how that unfolds. But there is currently a huge mineral deal on the table between the United States and DRC, so we'll see how much they are aligning in terms of the voting that they do in the next 2 years. One of the other big issues is that recognizing a member state obviously is political. Palestine, for example, has non-member observer status as of 2012. So they are allowed to observe the proceedings of the General Assembly, and they can become party to UN treaties, but they don't have a vote, and they also cannot hold any leadership positions. They can't run for Secretary General. So basically, Palestine is the District of Columbia of the UN. No taxation without representation, baby. But that recognition is political. Palestine holds that status because the United States refuses to consider their application for membership as part of the United Nations General Assembly as a full state. Because the United States on the Security Council is vetoing that vote, it will just continue and sit in limbo. And they will, unless and until we get the United States to change their minds or stop blocking it, that's never going to come up for a vote. So it goes nowhere. And then the last piece is the limited minimal level of accountability for members. Although suspension or expulsion of members is possible, no member state has ever been suspended or expelled from the United Nations, even if they have broken treaties that have been ratified, even if they have broken treaties that should have been enforceable by the UN Security Council. Generally because the countries that commit actions worthy of suspension or expulsion are permanent members of UN Security Council. And a member state can only be suspended or expelled upon the recommendation of the Security Council. So again, that veto vote, you just need the one person to veto out of those 5 on the Security Council and the issue doesn't pass. Yeah, sorry, I just painted a really bleak, depressing picture for you guys. The next thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is some of the courts and the mechanisms that are in place for international law and how that functions. The biggest ones we're going to talk about today, there are others, but these are the ones that matter the most. We have the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and then some ad hoc international criminal tribunals. For the ICJ, this was also started around the same time as the UN. There were precursors before, but this body became, as it is now, 1945, just after World War II. This is the only legal body of the United Nations. So of all of the different things that are signed on, even when there are enforcement mechanisms, UN Security Council can enforce those, but they can't actually pass. They are deciding disputes between states. So this is where it's state-to-state complaints. The ICC is individuals who are on trial for specific actions. So that's the biggest difference between the two. The ICC is also not part of the UN because the United Nations is set up to be a state-to-state level engagement. The ICJ decides disputes between states, only those that recognize its jurisdiction. Jurisdiction relies on the basis of consent, which is a huge problem. The ICJ issues legal opinions. It gives advisory opinions on international legal issues. It interprets international treaties. It consists of 15 judges. Again, I'm sure you guys will be shocked to know 5 of them permanent members. Guess which 5 they are? The same ones as the United Nations Security Council. They always hold 5 of those 15 seats. They have not given them up to date. This court covers various issues. So that court, for example, we're going to dig into the case study, but they ruled against the US's covert war in Nicaragua, that was a violation of international law in Nicaragua versus the United States. So the United States withdrew from compulsory jurisdiction in 1986, which basically said that they don't think that this was under the jurisdiction of the ICJ, so they don't need to abide by the outcome of the case. The UN Security Council has the power to enforce the court's rulings, but enforcement is subject, again, to the veto power of the 5 big players on the Security Council. I'm going to skip to this side real quick just to go over the ad hoc criminal tribunals. So those have been established by the UN Security Council in the past. We're talking about one for former Yugoslavia, one for Rwanda, because those issues at the time didn't fit into the ICJ, and the ICC didn't exist yet. So the ICC was created because they realized there was a gap between state to state cases and individuals taking responsibility for actions that were conducted on a horrific, massive scale. So for the International Criminal Court, they're prosecuting individuals under international criminal law. This is not part of the UN. The cases are focusing on individual perpetrators of crimes like genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. Also, like, full disclaimer, I am not a lawyer, so like, don't commit crimes or don't commit crimes on my word, like, just a disclaimer there. But I have taken a bunch of classes on international humanitarian law, so I do know some of this stuff. So the same issue for the ICC as for the ICJ, that some governments refuse to recognize the court's jurisdiction. So for example, Sudan, al-Bashir, he had a warrant issued for him at the ICC. As long as Sudan refused to recognize the authority of the ICC and he didn't go to any country that did, he was not actually forced to go and stand trial. The other thing, I'm sure you guys will all be shocked to know, is that the ICC has historically been accused by civil groups of bias, Eurocentrism, and racism. Everyone shocked. In this one, just really quick, we're going to talk about Nicaragua versus the United States. I learned about this last night as I was creating this slide, so don't ask me any intense questions about it. The short history of the U.S. intervention in Nicaragua: U.S. repeatedly intervened starting in 1909 with an invasion of U.S. Marines, resulted in the occupation and formation of a pro-U.S. government, ultimately gave the U.S. perpetual rights over the Panama Canal. In 1927, there was a major uprising against the U.S. occupation, and in 1933, the U.S. Marines withdrew entirely, which led to a dictatorship taking place from 1937 to 79. So it's a long fucking time. The downfall of this dictator is attributed to the embezzlement of millions of dollars of foreign aid after a major earthquake in 72. The Sandinista movement, which is also known as the FSLN, organized relief, expanded its influence, and took revolutionary leadership in the wake of the embezzlement case against the dictator. They gathered a bunch of people that were really pissed at the government for mishandling and misappropriating funds, and then they ended up taking power of the government in 1979. As a socialist group, this group threatened the United States. The Carter administration started supporting the Somocistas with financial and military aid. This is a different group that is not socialist, that was US friendly. And then when Reagan took office, he increased direct support to the Contras, to an anti-Sandinista group. The case was that the US was charged with recruiting, training, I'm not going to read all of these guys because there's a lot, but arming, financing, supporting military and paramilitary actions in and against Nicaragua in violation of treaty obligations under the UN. Ultimately, Nicaragua said that the US had breached international law. They demanded that the US actions stop and that they pay reparations for the damage to the people, property, and economy of Nicaragua. The court, the ICJ, did find that the United States was in breach of its obligations under international law and guilty of having violated the sovereignty of another nation. Consequences? Zero, because the United States is on the UN Security Council, and the UN Security Council has 5 permanent members, all of whom can veto any accountability action that is taken. So the US refused to participate in the proceedings because they said that the ICJ didn't have jurisdiction. This was not something they needed to be involved in. The US blocked enforcement of this judgment using its veto power on the Security Council, preventing Nicaragua from ever obtaining any compensation. So this shows that there is as you guys can tell, there's a huge likelihood that member states that have veto power on the Security Council will use that for their own protection to achieve their own goals. The United States has used this before to avoid legal responsibility for things that have brought up in both the ICJ and other international courts. This is a quote from one of the lawyers that was defending Nicaragua in this case. And he said, "It's another indication that this United States presidential administration has no regard for international law. When international law conflicts with a foreign policy objective of the administration, they will throw international law into the wastebasket." I feel like that's pretty much my whole presentation in a nutshell, guys. So, not ideal. I will say, though, that there has been a shift. So in the court's early years, most of the declarations made by the International Court of Justice were made by industrialized countries. Since the 86 Nicaragua case, declarations made by developing countries have increased significantly, which reflects a growing confidence in the court. The cases have not been targeted towards those main 5 veto holders, though. So do with that what you will. The last thing before I hand over is we're going to talk about what laws these courts are enforcing. What are the different pieces that different governments and states are supposed to be beholden to? International law. This is basically who is held accountable for violating things and who is not. The TLDR of this is that the system suffers from a lack of accountability and enforcement. I'm sure you guys are shocked by this. So the existing system sucks, especially because the setup of the United Nations is built in a way that none of the major perpetrators of a lot of these crimes are going to be held accountable for their actions. The sources of international law tend to be international treaties, international customs, general widely recognized principles of law, and legal precedent or standards that have been set. So, for example, the Geneva Conventions for the protection of war victims. There is a difference, just FYI, between state level or domestic legal systems and the international law system, because the international law system largely relies on consent of the parties. They have to say, like, we believe in you and that you exist and have power for any judgment to take effect. So that's kind of a major gap. In general, consequences for non-compliant countries with recognized international law basically just look like economic punishments. So we're talking coercive diplomacy, or sanctions, or going to war in rare cases. But all of those are very imperial approaches, and generally only rich countries can go with those options, can put economic sanctions into place, can go to war over a specific issue of international law breaking. So the biggest ones that I wanted to talk to you guys about, because I know the most about these ones, are international humanitarian law, international human rights law, genocide, and the responsibility to protect. So those last two are tied together. We will get to them. I will go to the next slide in just a second, but just wanted to flag also, that slide has mentions of genocide because we're digging into it, also of sexual violence. So if that's something that bothers you, feel free to take a walk or turn things on mute. Before we do, I just wanted to say this is all really complicated, pretty convoluted. With international humanitarian law, these are the laws of armed conflict, the laws of war, that seek to limit the effects of armed conflict upon civilians. This is what should be followed in Palestine, FYI. This is what is not being followed in Palestine. International human rights law is the laws that are designated to promote human rights on social, regional, domestic levels during peace. So you are not bound to one system when you're in a time of war. You are bound to the other system when you are in a time of peace. It's ridiculous, basically. It's a lot of like waffling, essentially. For genocide, that is violence that targets individuals because of their membership to a group. It is aimed at the destruction of a people. And the Genocide Convention is a major law of the world. So that is something that has been ratified by every country. It is tied to responsibility to protect, which is a global political commitment made at UNGA in 2005. That's the UN General Assembly in 2005, that focuses on the prevention of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, other acts of the like. This is a multi-pillared principle. The most important thing that you should know is that responsibility to protect requires states to take collective action to protect a population if any state is manifestly failing in its protection responsibilities. So if a state openly names a situation as a genocide, that state is legally required to react and to respond to protect the population that is against which the genocide is being perpetuated. The official use of the word genocide obligates military support at the minimum to respond. So I'm sure you guys will be shocked to know there are issues with this. There is persistent fighting over whether, how, when this happens. The issue of sovereignty comes up, whether a country has the right to violate the boundaries of another country to protect the people within that country. It also, again, requires the consent of the violators for enforcement. So if a country says that they're not committing a genocide, they just happen to be killing every single Rwandan from a specific ethnic group, then, and they don't consent to involvement, then there's not very much that the international community can do. And because it's linked to the UN, it is subject to the same issues that the UN generally faces, which is often just dependent on the United Nations Security Council and what they allow to be taken up for discussion and what passes. Okay, so we're going to dig into the genocide in Rwanda specifically. Sorry, guys, this is getting real dark, but this is one of the ones I'm allowed to talk about at work. So during the Rwandan Civil War, there was a genocide against the Tutsi ethnic group from 7th of April to July 19th, 1994. So in these 100-ish days, Hutu militias, a different ethnic group, systematically killed hundreds of thousands of Tutsis, mostly men. Estimates of the deaths range between 500,000 and a million. 1.1 million. The goal was for the Hutus to kill every Tutsi living in Rwanda. Genocide was rooted in long-standing ethnic tensions, exacerbated by the Rwandan Civil War that had been ongoing for a few years, and it was marked by extreme violence. People were turning on their neighbors and killing them, and widespread sexual violence. So this stopped because a predominantly Tutsi rebel group took power over the entire government-controlled territory. So they basically took the whole state of Rwanda and were able to put a stop to it by defeating all of the government forces that were involved in perpetuating this genocide. So the question then becomes, what did the world do while this was happening? Who knew what, when, why didn't we do anything about it? Despite the scale of atrocities, and they were well known to be happening well before the 100 days ended, the international community failed to intervene and stop the killings. They only acted after the Tutsi rebel group had captured the government and controlled the territory. There was even a peacekeeping force, UN peacekeeping force in Rwanda for 6 months before this genocide started. And they were aware of the escalating ethnic tensions. They were aware of the plans that the Hutus had for mass extermination and of secret weapons caches. But when they requested from the UN headquarters to be able to conduct raids and to do what they could to prevent this from escalating, the request was denied. Subsequently, most of that peacekeeping force's Rwandan staff were murdered in the early days of the genocide. So everyone that was left was basically not able to do anything, even as they watched people getting murdered all over the country. This is one of my big beefs with the United Nations. They move too fucking slowly. The UN didn't even take up the issue of Rwanda and the genocide that was happening to reinforce the peacekeeping mission until May 17th, 40 days into the genocide, when most people had died in the first few weeks. And the reinforcement soldiers didn't arrive until June, at which point most of the hundreds of thousands of people had already been killed. I will also say that there are 3 countries that I wanted to point the finger at. France and Belgium both knew that the genocide was happening, and they conducted evacuations for their citizens from the country before the conflict started and during the first few days. Both of them refused to allow any Tutsis to evacuate with them. So even if they were staff at the embassy, they were not allowed to evacuate. Even if they were married to a French or Belgian citizen, they were left behind, and the citizen and the kids were taken. And they all ended up getting murdered because they got left behind in a country where they were being exterminated. The only Rwandans that they rescued were a few high-profile members of the government, including the president's wife. The US was also aware of what was going on, but they hesitated to act because they didn't want to repeat the mistakes they had made in Somalia the year before. So it was basically an optics issue. And then President Clinton is quoted as having said that this was the failure of the US government to intervene in Rwanda was one of his main foreign policy failings. Yeah, so sorry to bring the mood down more than it already was. As a result from this situation, as I mentioned, they created a second level of legal cases that allowed people to be tried individually rather than as like a state level. So the UN Security Council established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda to hold the perpetrators, the individuals themselves, accountable for their actions and for other serious violations of international law in Rwanda by Rwandans in the area. 75 people were tried, 61 individuals were convicted, and 14 were acquitted. That's, I mean, 1 million people murdered and 75 people saw consequences for that. The community is left in shambles. A great example of post-conflict rehabilitation and how communities reconcile after things like that. But this was majorly, the majority of this genocide is specifically attributable to the history of imperialism and to the United States and other countries that are former colonizers. It was a major failure of the international community to respond, even though they knew what was happening. The UN had critical information. Western states saved their own citizens, but they didn't save any of the people who were actually at risk. Empire prioritized their own and their image over intervening and actually putting a stop to it. Sounds a lot like Gaza right now. Okay, I'm almost done, I promise, and then I'm handing over to Rishi. So essentially, there are a series of issues across the United Nations, international law systems, the way that things are set up currently. Bias of the courts makeup. So they all have Western centrism because they have 5 permanent members who all have veto power. The responsibility to protect framework and its application has a huge blind spot regarding the persecution of people with non-heteronormative sexuality. I have not had time to dig into that specific aspect of it. Not in Rwanda. This is just in general, they don't protect people that are gay. And it's also just not taken into account. It's referred to as the cis heteronormative blindfold. So they're not analyzing situations based on LGBTQ risks, particular risks to LGBTQ community members. These legal codes basically have been created to facilitate shitty behavior of imperial countries while punishing third worldist countries. There is no meaningful enforcement for violators that are permanent members of UN Security Council. And imperial countries don't really care anyways, because they can't be held accountable. They have the power to do what they want, and they have power not to be stopped. So that's the end of my part. Rishi?
Thanks. I just want to go into some slightly more specific examples to sort of expound on what Stephanie was talking about. The first thing I want to talk about is the way decolonial movements have been treated by both the UN and international law in the past. As Stephanie mentioned, international law was written by the victors of World War II, and as such has several facets and expressions that specifically reflect this particular position on the world stage, namely around colonialism. Many of the states that ratified the Geneva Conventions were not even states when they were originally written, as Stephanie was pointing out, which was 1952 when the Geneva Conventions were introduced and begun to be adopted by states. As originally written, the conventions made the prosecution of a decolonial war of national self-determination essentially a violation of international law in itself. Every single decolonial movement, be it Algerian independence, the Bush War, the Mexican Revolution, etc., were all people's wars, or wars fought with a very blurred line between combatants and the civilian populace to begin with, because most of the combatants were essentially not regulars that were part of a organized militia with a hierarchical command structure. They were, in fact, civilians who were fighting against a foreign occupation of their land. Article 19, second paragraph of Convention 1 provides the responsible authorities shall ensure that fixed military establishments and mobile medical units are, as far as possible, situated in a manner that attacks against military objectives cannot imperil their safety. So essentially, military installations and medical units have to be separate from the civilian populace. This is impossible if you're not allowed to hold a regular military. Like if you're occupied by a foreign power, this is not a possible thing for a ragtag group of decolonial resistance fighters to do. This was the case until 1977, when Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, which is essentially an amendment, was written that dictates the rules for armed conflicts in which people are fighting against colonial domination or alien occupation against racist regimes in the exercise of the right of self-determination. And these correct some of these gaps, but notably, Protocol 1 is not ratified by either Israel, as they feel it would legitimate Palestinian resistance, for example, or the US for another. Interestingly enough, the US has signed Protocol 3, the third amendment to the Geneva Conventions. I believe it was 87, but that may not be the right date, which calls for soldiers to be specifically marked to distinguish themselves from the civilian populace. And they're assigned to this one, but not the other amendments, because this rule can be weaponized against their perceived military threats and enemies at the time, meaning guerrilla forces, largely in whatever Middle Eastern country they were in the process of destroying at the time. The second example, Stephanie touched on this pretty well. I just wanted to say it a little bit more explicitly. The definition of genocide in international law, according to Article 2 of the Geneva Accords, involves two parts. The more commonly understood physical element, which includes killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group. inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole or in part, preventing births or transferring children. But the other and much more difficult element in cases of genocide is that the prosecution needs to prove that the perpetrators had the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. One of the biggest failures, I think, historically that we can point to, just in terms of like the numbers of deaths that we commonly attribute to cases of genocide in history, is the US invasion of Vietnam, which was long lasting as part of the larger Vietnam conflict, led to estimates range from somewhere between 1 million and 3 million civilian deaths. So, on the scale of more commonly understood genocides, there were even explicit orders that would seem to prove genocidal intent, such as the existence of free fire zones in which soldiers were not only allowed but encouraged to shoot with complete impunity at whatever they wanted to. An actual dispatch order was given in several cases with the exact quote, "kill anything that moves," in certain specific conflagrations of the war. The existence of search and destroy missions where a small group of soldiers would be sent with essentially no oversight to go and eliminate a certain target. And yet, despite all of these sounding completely callous towards civilian life, none of these count as genocidal intent because all of them have a military objective that can be used as an excuse or pointed to. So, as Stephanie said previously, you can kill as many people as you want as long as you come up with an excuse that has some sort of military objective or other objective other than the elimination of the group in whole or in part. It is unenforceable as genocide. This is one of the most damning quotes for why post-colonial nations may have less investment in systems of international governance. This is the former foreign minister of Vietnam. "We don't have such a high regard for the UN as you do." The reporter responded, "Why is that?" And the foreign minister responded, "Because during the last 40 years, we have been invaded by 4 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council," which is really something to think about. We can think of other historical or contemporary examples where the international governments seems hypocritical, but was actually constructed in such a way with nearly surgical precision that it can't be enforced against the people who wrote it, namely the US, the British Empire, and even the Soviet Union to an extent. Another interesting example, the Cambodian genocide, commonly understood by most people, historically speaking, to have been a genocide. Only the murder of the Vietnamese minority and the Muslim minority in Cambodia counts as genocidal acts. The millions of Khmer Cambodian people killed by the Khmer Rouge cannot be prosecuted as genocide because it was also perpetrated by Khmer people with no stated intent of destroying their own ethnic group, as lawyers would argue. So there are a lot of examples of falling flat. The Bush administration, in another great example of what Stephanie said as like state buy-in being necessary for the enforcement of international law, unsigned the Rome Statute agreeing to the jurisdiction of the ICC in 2002. Conveniently, this was just before the same administration committed several prosecutable war crimes in Iraq, including the use of chemical weapons that are still killing Iraqis suffering from exposure-related illness to this day. Going even further than what Stephanie said, it's sometimes not even that the international governing bodies fall flat in their ability to enforce what they need to, or that they are hypocritical in their enforcement. Sometimes the international bodies themselves are weaponized against either colonized people or people in the global south in particular cases to launder the application of imperial interests in their countries. A good example of this, of course, the United States Partition Plan for Palestine. There were competing nationalist movements and a emerging ethno-nationalist movement in Zionism that wanted sovereign statehood in British Mandatory Palestine. This was handed over to the United Nations. 70% of the land was given to Jewish settlers. 33 countries, mostly all other settler states or imperial centers, approved this charter. 13 opposed, mostly all former colonized or Arab countries. Notably, the population of Palestine and many Arab states were not given a say in the matter. In this way, the UN was weaponized to give the appearance of international consensus to something that was only largely agreed upon by states in or aligned with the global north. Another great example is the UN peacekeeping force that was deployed in the Congo. Following the collapse of the central government in the Congo, the peacekeeping force was deployed and originally had the mission of staying neutral in the war to adhere to the principle of non intervention that the UN has in its charter. However, the UN and specifically the Security Council at the time valued the territorial integrity of the Congo above nearly all else in the conflict. So the scope of the mission increased from merely peacekeeping over time to enforcing the peace and even supporting particular factions in that war, resulting in what essentially amounted to yet another foreign military pacifying the Congo in the same way they had experienced under the Belgians for a long time. Today, in poll after poll, a majority of Congolese do not see the UN intervention as a positive historical event protecting their lives, but rather as yet another unwelcome foreign interference. Given all this, what can we think of as alternatives for the current structure of international governance? Well, certain things have worked well. To an extent, the UN is an international forum. Smaller or colonized countries have been afforded an opportunity on occasion to speak their concerns before the international community. For example, Prime Minister Nehru of India was able to galvanize international support at the UN against the discrimination of Indians in South Africa, and moreover, to prevent the annexation of German Africa into South Africa to have sort of a united greater South Africa that would be placed under British control, as was the intention of the governing party of South Africa at the time, which was a Boer majority that favored British control over South Africa. This actually ended up galvanizing international support against it, and it didn't happen as a result. They also support self determination in many resolutions. And while Stephanie did touch upon how these are nearly unenforceable in the majority of cases, several independence movements have been legitimized in the eyes of the international community by the UN and by the structure of international law and governance as it is right now, such as Algerian independence, which was supported by resolution after resolution in the UN, which really helped counter the narrative that the French government was putting forth at the time, that these were essentially a lawless group of terrorists attempting to like just destabilize the entire country. So what has to change? Stephanie touched on a lot of these things: accountability. More importantly, I think the biggest thing we've talked about over and over again today is that there needs to be sovereign equality of the member states. The UN, having grown out of the League of Nations, actually ends up being functionally just a legitimized version of the already soft power imbalances that were inherent to the League of Nations that preceded it. It's an organization ostensibly with sovereign equality among its members, but in practice, it is run by the world powers and is a way for world powers to negotiate with one another. The UN formalized this under the Security Council. International governments without a permanent Security Council is imaginable for us, and that would alleviate the problem of these institutions actually working as a mediating force between the existing world powers and reach towards fulfilling the stated function of the UN and its charter. Post-colonial states also need a forum to discuss their own development, but to do so constantly in the presence of the imperial countries that controlled them and led to the sort of interstate dependency and financial dependency that causes many of the problems internally that they experience to begin with, seems counterproductive. If it were possible to have a way for a formation in which post-colonial world can gather independently of the European and Western powers and discuss their own development without the UN essentially functioning as a way to like launder imperial maneuvers against them, that is something else we can potentially imagine. Okay, that is it for my slides.
So yeah, now we're gonna move to question and answer time, guys. And then also we have some discussion questions for y'all as well. There's a question in the room, but you're gonna have to come use the mic up here if you don't mind.
What is the value of sovereignty? I was born elsewhere. I value the sovereignty of my country very highly. I think it's actually, I am not from a free country. I'm from a European country, but so in a sense, in the imperialist center or semi-periphery, not a free country. Most of the countries in this world are not in a position of sovereignty, and sovereignty is a very valuable thing. And I thought this was missing from this presentation. And of course, the UN has this contradiction within it between sovereignty, avoiding war, and then trying to base. One thing that didn't come up is also in the Universal Human Rights Declaration of Human Rights. So, what are American socialists, if they had to pick and choose, what would they enhance and where would they have to apply self restraint, given the context that we're not in a single state? We're not in a world state with the world police. Like those are just linguistic pretensions that then hide something else. But like, given all this mess, how do we start thinking about picking, choosing, and again, where do we exercise restraint? Where are we willing to recognize the limits of global governance? A lot of wars have been sold to Americans in the name of protecting others. And now we see that that's bullshit. But when that was done, it was not that we were honest then and now we're insincere. We were insincere then. But there is value, like Rishi just said, in this contradictory experience of the United Nations. And as agents, as political agents, what do we play up and what do we resist?
Yeah, I think that one way to think about this is, yeah, the world police framing is like more equipped, yes, but I think understanding international law in the same way we think about domestic law to an extent, something that centers the victim of an atrocity, something where we think about application of international law in a more abolitionist setting where we don't decide that like this is the letter of the law and we are going to like come in and punish you because we as like an international governing body know better. Like we should, I think, attempt to understand preventing war, preventing like mass atrocities in a way that centers the victim of those atrocities a little bit better. And that probably is going to mean changing the dynamic of the way these laws are enforced, especially in terms of like sending in peacekeeping forces, et cetera, et cetera. I think like this should be something that where the victim is leading the way, or the people affected in the area are leading the way, rather than the international body.
I agree. Hang on one second. I was just going to say this was like the first discussion question I had for you guys. So great question.
Building on what Rishi said, I think that there is obviously, with centering the victim, a role for the international community to help support them and defend them. But for the participation of like the US, UK, other current and former colonial powers to be justifiable, we have to submit ourselves to the same sort of scrutiny and, consequences as we are meeting out on other people. And so without that, we have no standing to even be involved in this.
Yeah, I mean, you make a really great point. If we're not actually willing to answer to the systems that we have been involved in establishing, then like with the US saying that they don't agree with even being involved in the case with Nicaragua against the United States, then we have nowhere to go within the legal framework that currently exists. Like it exists and we should also be held accountable. So my conclusion is ban lawyers and then we're good. That was a joke for any lawyers that are here. One of the questions that came to my mind, and I know that people talk a lot about like the world police force, and that's what the peacekeepers are supposed to be, but the peacekeepers don't actually have very much power, and they are still dependent on the United Nations Security Council letting them do stuff. At the same time, we as democratic socialists are wanting to move towards abolition. We're wanting to move away from having police and from having police systems, prison systems, the school to prison pipeline. So how do we, I guess I'm struggling a lot with the contradiction between like we should be intervening in something if we see that a crisis is ongoing. Like that is a moral imperative that I mean, right now, Sudan has literally been declared a genocide by the United States as of November. And even though they said the G word, I don't necessarily want the United States to be the world police force. And I don't actually really want there to be a world police force. I just kind of want people to stop sucking. So I don't really know what to do with those seemingly contradictory issues.
I don't think I have a good answer, but for Gaza, the problem is that we're participatory. Like The main problem is abstaining from something. And in fact, very often, if like Italy or France or UK or NATO or the United States would abstain from going into the little pseudo moralistic crusades that are really like wars, that's the agency we have, is to stop our government from going to war or selling war through other guises. Now that still leaves the problem, and we don't have a good resolution, like who can stop the war done by somebody else. But we're engaged in a lot of wars that we start, and sometimes we call them wars of choice. We have a lot of words for them, and they get sold through different packaging. It's the same cola, but to us, it's the well-meaning people. It's sold as a responsibility to protect, and to somebody else, it's about like Darwinism and the right to go grab other people's resources. So that's another thing that didn't come up, but and that leaves still a whole chunk of other conflicts. But it would, we have agency on a number of them, and let's at least try to tackle those. And then we can't solve. And I'm not saying we can't solve our problem. I'm just saying like there's different categories of interventions. So.
Right. So basically, we have to stop being violence perpetrators before we should like we need to take care of our own house before we clean anybody else's kind of deal.
We have a question and a comment from Comrade Karen.
Is there any role or possibility for UN nations to send their military to support the UN troops that are already present? And their role would not be to fight anybody, but to protect the delivery of aid so that that aid would not be stopped by any country. That's really the critical question in Sudan as well as in Palestine right now.
I can tell you. So the issue with humanitarian aid specifically is that we are not allowed to have any weapons anywhere near any of our convoys. We can't have military escorts. We've actually had to leave specific countries in West Africa because the government wanted to mandate that we had military trucks with us. We cannot be tied to anybody because humanitarian organizations are bound to the principles of humanity, neutrality, and independence. And there's another one because it spells Heine, but I'm forgetting the second I. But so for that specific issue, it's not something that we can fix by increasing the number of peacekeepers. For the first thing that you flagged, so the peacekeeping missions are established by the Security Council. They're made up of people from different countries. And we didn't even get into this, but the majority of the peacekeepers that are getting sent to places are from underdeveloped countries. So for the one that's in DRC, they had it was like Moroccans, Ghanaians, and I'm forgetting one other one, but it tends to be from not United States contributing their troops. The other issue with sending a sovereign country's troops to a country to support them is violating the question of sovereignty, and also whether that is taken as an act of war by the government. If the government is the one that's perpetrating it, that is an act of war for troops to be sent into the country. So it's like a layer of diplomacy that super sucks. But I mean, yes, like in theory, it would be really great to be able to, have, that's what the diplomatic conversations are about, to actually like secure humanitarian corridors and like have deconflicted areas where aid can be distributed, where people know that there won't be bombs dropped. But in practice, it doesn't always work.
Also, correct me if I'm wrong, Stephanie, but the peacekeeping forces are not in any way like procedurally accountable to the people in the country they're deployed to, right?
No, they report to the Security Council. Yeah, which is how, like in Haiti, for example, there was in a lot of places, but in Haiti specifically, there was a huge rash of rape that has been of UN peacekeepers who were accused of rape by people that are living in the camps that they were supposed to be protecting. They don't have a higher power that they have to be accountable to other than the UNSC. And if you are working in a place where there's no internet access, for example, it's very difficult to use a formalized system to report acts that are crimes against humanity, basically, in those situations.
How do we prevent genocide without having that police? A lot of these are the consequences of the foreign intervention for exploiting resources, destabilizing governments, all of the things that colonial powers do in neocolonialism. And so we just stop doing that, then maybe things would get better.
No, that's a really good point. And this is something I've been thinking about is like you thinking about the colonial powers who have created the conditions under which these genocides are happening. If there's a way for, yes, for them to remove themselves from, you know, those situations or to not perpetuate them in the first place. And then also in like future genocides and things like that, like I feel like there should be like a group of countries, maybe permanent Security Council members, I don't know, who just should like be recuse themselves or be like prohibited from even like setting foot in these circumstances because like, you know, for logical reasons, that's something I've been.
I mean, I would love that, but the US has to consent to doing that. And so what we need is a president who doesn't suck.
I'm kind of like answering or like with the first question, a question in response to the first question, I guess, kind of like along the lines of what you guys were thinking. I feel like in past weeks, we talked a lot about like the counterweights that exist in the global south. Like, so for international finance institutions, like we talked about like how what BRICS's role is as like a counterweight. So like obviously this is like an international body in like the fullest extent, but like what would it look like to have some type of legal system that's more of that South-South cooperation angle? Is that something that's enforceable? And then like I guess just thinking about like how certain countries, even in the example of Palestine, have used like trade or specific like things to block Israel from doing things. Is there like, is that an enforcement mechanism we could use in like a global south centered legal framework of some kind, which is a very, and I don't know if there are other like examples that exist outside of that. So if anyone has any, yeah, kind of like what I was thinking. Um, but yeah, I don't know if anyone has examples, but that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, love that.
It's in the socialist tradition to be internationalist. So maybe like thinking about that. But before that, one of the issues when we talk about genocide, it leads the conversation to like, what do we do? And that's an imperialist question done from the imperial center in the capital of the biggest empire on this planet, which is like, what do we do to others? What do we do for others? Okay. And that's why that question gets posed, but most conflicts don't reach the level of genocide. And yet we are always doing things and always in the name of what do we do if genocide happens? And then when a real genocide happens, well, we're doing it. So let's just like be cognizant of who we are when we ask questions of what do we do collectively. So then since we're stuck with this role structurally, right? As socialists, we need to be internationalists, not an easy thing. And that means supporting other countries, other nations, other people's sovereignty, which is also not an easy thing. People. Well, states, because societies are organized in states, and that comes with its own contradictions, right? But any political issue requires unpacking, but making a commitment to that, not making a commitment to what do we do to them to help them. It's like, what do we do together? And one of the things is to respect other people's structures, histories, not because they're perfect, not because they're flawless. We're not. We don't deserve to be bombed. Solidarity with people, and then offer cooperation. That means like we need to elect people on this line, which we don't have in power in either party. And then also there's a state level thing, right? If we manage to elect the people we want in power in our state, but there's also people to people relationships and people to people solidarity. I'm a trade unionist. I don't wait for the American government to be lined up around international solidarity for labor to try and practice that. But I think exiting out of the logic that if we go to a university here will get taught to us or what TV tells us, which is like, what are we going to do? No, no, no. How do we do things together with others, which is the same problem we have here anyhow. Getting into that logic will get us into a lot of contradictions because it's not easy to work with the many others, right? But at least it gets us out of this logic. And paradoxically, by referring to the greatest and the worst outcome, it almost like numbs us to like this hyper interventionist and it sets us outside of the conflict when we're kind of very enmeshed, as many people here brought it up. But that's my like big like push for everybody's like, what do we do as socialists in America towards our regime, and then what do we do beyond it? Because there are things, like I said, that we're all probably just involved in, like in solidarity work.
But about like what do we do when there are genocides happening around the world, like and respecting the sovereignty of other states and things like that. There's going to be people in the state where the genocide is happening who are resisting that. So instead of helping
like people who are aligned with us and our foreign interests, helping people who have a better vision for like what their country should be.
I know that we've been talking a lot about like mutual aid, especially in DC, especially the last year or so. And since COVID, really, it's kind of blown up, but it was not invented here and it doesn't only exist in the United States. Sudan, they have what are called emergency relief rooms, ERRs. And that is basically Sudanese mutual aid networks that have been set up within the country that get funding from anybody who's able to like send it to them. So it doesn't work for Venmo because Venmo is an American thing, but you can figure out how to send money specifically to mutual aid networks that are working to prevent genocide. They are specifically delivering food and nutrition to the community members, both like in Khartoum and also like around the country. So that kind of stuff is in place. And I think some of it is just a reminder that like I should know about other countries and what systems they have set up so that we can, because people are already doing the work, as you mentioned. I think the other big thing that I was thinking about, the issue is comes down to capitalism. And as long as we're working within a system where resources equal money and people are therefore trying to pillage resources from countries and are willing to extort that to make money, like with DRC, for example, Democratic Republic of Congo, like this system is going to continue. And even if we are able to get electeds in office, that's great. But we still work within a system that is built on capitalism that depends on money. And as, I mean, think about climate change. Like we're fucking still building new oil rigs, even though we're supposed to be moving away from fossil fuels. Like as long as money is able to be made from doing certain activities, there are going to be people that are willing to bypass the humanity of it all. Like Sudan has a bunch of gold. So we're not super interested in stopping that conflict from happening because we can get the gold out more cheaply as long as people are distracted by the fighting and there are others that are, getting the gold out without following the proper procedures kind of deal. Like same with cobalt. This happens all over the world. So but we're going to go ahead and wrap up this session. Thank you guys all so much for coming and participating and asking great questions, asking the right questions. I learned a lot and I was presenting. So this has been really great. Thank you guys all for coming. Have a good day.